Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from the Southern California Linux Expo, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux that you said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. It's a special edition today, and we've got a panel from Canonical community members. We're going to learn a little bit about UbuCon and the wider scale conference. So welcome in. I'll introduce our panel. We've got Aaron Prisk. He is the part of the Canonical community team. Jason Nucciaroni. He is with the Canonical high performance computing team. Nathan Haynes, the Ubuntu community team. Richard Gaskin, Ubuntu California. We've got Eric Eichmeicher, who is the Ubuntu studio lead, Ken Van Dyne, who is an Ubuntu developer, and Larry Tavern, the Ubuntu Forums transition and Ubuntu board member. So I want to start with this. Maybe, Aaron, this would be a good question for you. Can you talk a little bit about UbuCon specifically, and in specific, what are the roots of UbuCon? Is it always co-located with a large event like Scale?
So UbuCons have been a major component of. Oh, thank you. All good. So UbuCons are first and foremost a community-run event.
I got it. Sorry.
Oh, you're good. Thank you. UbuCons are a community-run event. So this event is largely a product of the great work of volunteers like Richard, who's in the stands over here, and Nathan here beside me, and some of the other folks beside me here. They've been going on since basically the inception of Ubuntu some 20-odd years ago, happening all over the world. So we have UbuCons happening in Asia, in Latin America. Recently we had one in Africa, and they can be as small as 10 to 20 people just hanging out in a bar talking about how much they love Ubuntu, or it can be large-scale, very organized events with hundreds, if not thousands of people. But again, these are community-oriented events, and it's the one shared trait they have is they have a mutual love and respect for Linux and Ubuntu.
Can you talk a little bit about the requisite size of the conference? Is it always is it always large, or can it be microscopic?
It can be very small. So I think there's this perception, especially from folks that want to have an UbuCon, is they need to have a large-scale event, no pun intended, like this with thousands of people. But it doesn't need to be that way. It can be a very small event. In Nigeria this past year, they had their first UbuCon, and this is the Ubuntu Nigeria. It started off with, I think, about 30 folks. And that's it. That's all you need for an UbuCon. And that's what we want. We want to show folks that you don't need to have this huge organizing team and tens of thousands of dollars. No, just, again, you need that mutual love and adoration for Linux and Ubuntu.
So I want to recognize for just a moment a pillar of the open source community that passed away, and that is, of course, Steve, or probably maybe better known in the community as Vorlin. And he passed away earlier this year. Steve was an absolute pillar of the open source community, and we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge him. He was one of the first employees of Canonical, extraordinarily community-oriented man. The thing that stood out to many of us was that he was focused on quality, because when you're building software for 40 million people to use, you have to get it right, and it has to work. You can't just throw it out there. And Steve did that. And so trying to connect Steve with a larger goal of people and relationships. And I had an opportunity a few different times to meet with Steve and engage with them. And what stood out to me above everything else was the conversations we would have. They weren't necessarily always technical in nature. They were people-focused. And even if somebody asked him a technical question, or even if there was something technical for him to comment on, he would be quick to draw it back to the community, back to the relationships, back to the people who he knew made those software projects possible. And so, I think there were some people that would say that they butted heads with Steve, but I think if you asked them, they would tell you that that was a good thing. And that he was, anytime that he pushed back on something or offered resistance, it was towards a good cause. And so even if you were on the receiving end of that, you understood where Steve's heart was coming from. Steve was part of the Foundations team. Can one of you guys tell me or speak a little bit about what the Foundations team is and what they do?
I would say Eric might have some good insight here.
Well, the foundations team is basically the people who basically lay the foundation of Ubuntu. Now, you have the kernel team, which handles the kernel, but then above that, you have things that are like systemd and the installer process, Subiquity installer in this case. A lot of people that just kind of handle the lower inner workings of Ubuntu, set the standard seed, set the minimal seed, and make sure that all of that is going to work with whatever you stack on top of it. And they are the foundations team. They are all working at Canonical, and they all do a fantastic job.
Can you tell me a little bit about what sort of things the foundation team, what kind of issues they deal with, and how they address those things? Specifically, protocol for when there's maybe a disagreement or maybe there's an understanding of the best way to resolve an issue.
I can speak to that too because I've been there. So if there's a problem with how to resolve an issue, really those types of things go not really so much in the foundations team. That gets directed to the technical board or whatever team is handling the situation, whether that's release, SRU, archive admins, and usually all of those are foundations team members. There are some exceptions. However, when you get to a issue that needs to be resolved, it needs to go to one of those teams. If you can't resolve it there, you get the technical board that gets involved, and above that, if still things cannot get resolved, then it's the community council that gets involved.
I want to touch base on the HPC space. I think some people would be surprised to learn there's a very healthy and thriving community around high performance computing. And I think there are some of us that have the impression that, hey, high performance computing isn't something that we're doing inside of our mom's basement. It is likely something that is happening at this huge enterprise level with a lot of money. That's not necessarily accurate. Jason, could you speak to that?
It's a little interesting holding two mics here at the same time. I got big hands, but I also don't want to clank the heads here. I do think one thing that's always interesting is I think I came to the community, about 2 years ago, and I said, hey, I want to start a high performance computing team. And it's like, wait, you want to start something that's kind of outside the purview of, say, the desktop, traditional interactions with the distribution, through PCs and all that. And kind of the case that I made is a lot of these industries, are very built around collaboration and working together on open source software. So for, example, you'll have open infrastructure projects like OpenStack just for building clouds. You have Kubernetes and all that stuff. And so basically we said, why can't we do the same thing for HPC, where we can kind of be the rallying point for professionals and developers and system administrators who want to use Ubuntu in their high performance computing workloads without necessarily looking at it through the commercial perspective, where it's like, hey, we're courting you so we can take your money, but more rather looking at it as an opportunity where it's like, hey, we all kind of have a common itch that we want to scratch. Why don't we kind of put our heads together and use the solid foundation that Ubuntu is to actually work together to develop a common platform?
What would you say to somebody who says, I want to get involved in the HPC space, I want to get started, but again, I don't have a connection to a university, maybe I don't have a connection to a large organization. How would somebody get started in that space or get connected to that community?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point that you bring up, because I know that's a challenge that the HPC industry has currently, where it's obviously we see lots of people throwing money at AI data centers and being like, oh, we got all this hardware, this is great, but we got nobody who knows how to use it. And so kind of what we're starting to see is a lot more people are interested in kind of pursuing careers in HPC type roles, where it's they're managing these large clusters for processing large amounts of data. And I find one thing that's really interesting, and one thing that Ubuntu, has kind of paved the way in, is where its accessibility, where, I was 4 years old when Ubuntu came out, so I can't maybe comment on how things were then. But, obviously you kind of see where Linux was a huge challenge for a lot of people. A lot of folks wanted to use it, they were interested in it, but, obviously when you get a bunch of floppy disks in the mail saying, hey, just plug this in and hope everything goes right, obviously there's that challenge of it becomes very daunting, and Ubuntu kind of lowered that barrier where it's shipping CDs. Now it's all you need is a USB drive. And so we're kind of trying to do the same thing in HPC, where it's okay, obviously, if you want to really do serious work, you want to make lots of money, you're going to need these like top of the line hardware with like NVIDIA GPUs, high speed interconnects, and all that. But we take special care to actually make our software in such a way where a lot of it can be virtualized on a single desktop. So, for example, with like LXD or Multipass or something like that, we're able to actually spin up like these tiny little virtual clusters. So while you're not training these gigantic AI workloads, you're still able to kind of get that exposure of deploying, managing, and actually running workloads on a supercomputer.
Kind of at the other opposite end of the HPC space is maybe the desktop space. And Canonical recently appointed Jean-Baptiste as the director of engineering for Ubuntu Desktop. Now, there's two things that stand out to me there. The first thing that stands out to me is that, in fact, there's a position called the director of engineering for Ubuntu Desktop, which implies that Canonical has a vested interest in the Ubuntu Desktop. Jean-Baptiste says, quote, "I'm eager to push the Ubuntu Desktop even further by bringing innovation, building a powerful and stable, polished environment, and making it accessible to everybody." So a question for anybody on the panel, can you tell me why is Canonical appointing an engineering for the Ubuntu Desktop? What is the focus on the Ubuntu Desktop?
Usually if you see me double fisting, it's at the bar at game night, so this is new. So Ubuntu started as a desktop project as a way to make Linux and really software, especially free software, just available and accessible to anyone in the world, regardless of the resources, regardless of the internet speed, regardless if they have the fastest computer or a slow one. That's why Canonical shipped so many CDs for free. They gave me 50,000, click, and So that's always been very important. Now, this Ubuntu server nonsense is that people were misappropriating the desktop and uninstalling the GUI, and well, there might have been Ubuntu server first, but it just got so popular that they had to say, oh, okay, we need to, it was like release number 4, they delayed 2 months, that's why it's 606 LTS, and not 604, because they changed the name, to polish it because, and support it for 3 years, nowadays 5, actually 10 for free with the subscription, or 12 if you pay a little extra, because Ubuntu was so powerful and stable that they're like, we want this on our servers too, except every 6 months is a little much. So that's always been a core value of Ubuntu is accessibility and information software freedom. And so with the desktop, if it's a server, there's not too much to polish if things are going well, but on the desktop, things are always moving. There's no better hardware, better graphics, sound cards, graphical interfaces, a desktop experience that Ubuntu has always paved the way, I think, pioneered a really nice accessible default install packages and UI and just interacting with your computer to make it, and translations to make it easy. And so that's why there needs to be someone dedicated at Canonical. There's so many volunteers. Canonical couldn't do it without all the volunteers in the Ubuntu community. But there still needs to be someone who's being paid to make sure that everything works, and it's a task that's Herculean, but is and important, but also possible with that collaboration between Canonical and Ubuntu, because Canonical, as Mark said at the summit, is Ubuntu. It is all one big community.
Talk to me a little bit, if you would, specifically about the business value to the Ubuntu desktop. So I think there's sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, there's lots of money to be made on servers and on containers and all of these things, but the reality is, to a degree, is there not an entrance barrier if you're, let's say, a Windows system admin, and you come into the Linux or Ubuntu space and you say to yourself, how do I get started? If there's a graphical desktop and it's pleasant to use and you can start by just opening my web browser, checking my email, those sorts of things, and then I can easily drift and or begin to explore the wide range of open source and Linux software, is there a business case to be made for supporting Linux on the desktop?
I think there really is. Not only can it be used for things like with the Ubuntu core, you can create digital signage, and the Ubuntu core automatically updates everything, and then you update your snap you built on top of that, and it automatically updates in the field everywhere. You can build kiosks and displays, and you can have your all your administrative staff running Ubuntu LTS computers, and they get updates, and it's just solid, stable, nothing changes, it's predictable, because the last thing you need all your receptionists doing is fighting bugs and crashes. You want them to just work and not even know that it's there. So that's really why it's important. And I think if you need more proof that there's a business case for it, Microsoft officially supports Ubuntu in Windows 11 through the Windows subsystem for Linux. And they started with Ubuntu. They think it's super important, even for developers. In fact, you can say, run it, say snap install Firefox, and it will pop up in your start menu with a little penguin on the icon in the corner. And you can run both, you can run everything. So Linux is so stable and reliable, I think it's just a really good value for businesses. And nice thing is they get that for free because of the community. So.
So two things come to mind. I was speaking with Ken, who's in the crowd here last. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Ken. We were talking last night about how Ubuntu is being used by some big Hollywood studios right down the road from here who see the value in having a stable, secure, robust desktop that they can trust, and how they made the switch from another rather popular Linux distro because they saw the value that Ubuntu provides. I was just speaking with a university this past week in Madrid, Spain. They switched all of their data science labs over to Ubuntu, and they're looking at the data science stack that Ken demoed earlier. There is an enormous number of Ubuntu desktops out there. Sometimes we don't know that they're there, but there's a lot of them. Ken, feel free to jump at any point if you'd like. Please. The man with all the secret numbers.
I can't share the numbers.
The panel, like Ubuntu, is a collaborative experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken Van Dyne, former engineering director of the desktop team. I now work in our alliances organization. I work directly with our PC OEM partners and companies like that, silicon vendors and things like that. I will say there is a tremendous demand for Ubuntu on the desktop out there, and it is growing, and it is growing fast, which is amazing to see. 1990s Ken would have been very excited to see what we're seeing today, which is great. And I think things like data science and AI movement, there's really nobody else in town doing it as far as an OS goes. You can't really do these sorts of workloads on Windows natively. Typically, if you install data science tools on a Windows machine, you're installing it in Ubuntu on WSL. You're not actually doing it on Windows. You're doing it on Ubuntu and WSL. But there's demand for enterprise type use cases where it's both like task-oriented type workers as well as developers. More and more companies are either buying preloads or they're buying Windows preloads and then reinstalling Ubuntu on it because they're Ubuntu certified. So the Ubuntu certified program is a very powerful program for us and our partners, obviously.
While I have you here, I didn't have a chance to ask you this earlier, but would you be able to speak a little bit about the Foundations team, Steve Roland, and his passing, and what the role of community, the Foundations team, I know that you worked with him. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, losing Steve, I mean, it hurts. I've worked with Steve for many years. He was an amazing individual, and he was really a force to be reckoned with on our Foundations team. But not just for the Foundations team, for Ubuntu in particular. Like, he was always kind of our voice of sanity in the back of our head. Like, if somebody had some crazy idea, he was like very quick to reel you back in to say, that's not really following the Ubuntu culture. This is not what we're about. He was really great about being that voice in the back of our head. But I think there's a lot of people that have spent time working with people like Steve. And there's other people like him already that is like-minded within the company that will continue to speak up and kind of fill that role. As mentioned, the Foundations team is incredible. There's amazing people there, very, very motivated. It's actually a huge team. But all the distro teams are actually quite big. Ubuntu is, of course, a big thing for Canonical. So our desktop team is significant in size. The server team's pretty big as well. We have cloud engineering. They're all part of our Ubuntu org.
If you guys have questions for these guys, you let me know, and your questions will go to the front of the line. I want to talk a little bit about the community involvement via the forums. I think I'm going to tag Larry for this one. So the forum started back with, it was a vBulletin version 3, and it got horrifically hacked in 2013. Took the entire bulletin offline for about a month, and in that time, there was a tremendous loss of user base. So Larry, could you talk a little bit about what the community looked like back when we were on vBulletin 3 and how that hack back in 2013 affected it?
Yes. Back before the hack in 2013, it was July to be exact, the forums was much busy. We were so busy all the time. But after the hack, people, I think, were afraid that their information would get stolen. They had moved on to different avenues for support, like Ask Ubuntu and Reddit. Then we were hacked again in 2016, and that further diminished our posters. While we have 2.2 million members, the activity just kept dwindling. The other factor was that the security measures put in place when every night they would run, there was about 30 to 45 minutes that you couldn't post, you couldn't read nothing. The forums were down pretty much during that time, and we lost a lot of people over that. But I think, too, we lost user base just because Ubuntu became a lot more stable and doesn't need as much support as it used to.
Arguably a good thing. Let me ask you about the transition to Discourse, and maybe I'll touch base with Aaron here for just a second. So early on, Discourse was for non-technical people, right? And so the problem is, again, you'll sense a theme here, coming back to the relationships and the people, right? So you go to the Discourse and you ask a technical question, and you're told, go to Ask Ubuntu, effectively, get out of here, right? And so the perception, even if it wasn't intended this way, not very pleasant. Can you talk, and so that was the first time that we were on Discourse. Can you talk a little bit about that period and what the lessons were learned from Canonical?
So when I started working at Canonical about 3 years ago, that was one of the first things I noticed was we have this Ubuntu Community Hub, which is our Discourse, and it felt more like a place for Canonical just to dump their release notes and not talk about much else. And to me, that felt kind of counterintuitive to the community we wanted to foster. If it's a community hub, it should be a true community hub. And just for context, I think we were seeing on average, about 500,000 page views per month on our Discourse around that time. We wanted to push to make it a true hub by allowing technical support questions, reorganizing things, and encouraging our teams to just be more active there. If you're working on a cool project in Canonical, people want to know. Jason, I use Jason as an example, doing an amazing job of being more open with his work, because HPC, like you said, it's not something the average person does in their garage, but it's amazing work, and people want to hear about it. So we encourage Jason to just be more active on there and kind of serve as an example for our teams. And around a few months ago, we were planning to open up tech support questions and start to really fully utilize our Discourse. And around that time, the forums folks reached out to us and said they were looking to sunset the forums. And we thought this is the perfect opportunity to kind of blend these two efforts. So we basically onboarded a number of Ubuntu forums moderators to become part of our transition team, and they've been fantastic. I think there's this perception that the Ubuntu community is just this monolith. It really much is a community of communities, and they all have their own little sub-microculture that have formed over these platforms over the last 20 years. So trying to just say, oh, we'll just change platforms, how hard could it be, is much more difficult than you might think. And Larry can certainly testify to this. So we really wanted to make a really diligent effort to make sure that they felt empowered in this process. They were actual stakeholders and not just passerbyers that things happen to. And I can tell you that as of this week, after bringing over the forums folks and some of the changes we made, we're averaging about 3 to 3.5 million page views on the Discourse. So that's a pretty dramatic change over just a few months. And it goes to show that the community is there. We just have to make sure we provide them with the right tools and platforms to be successful.
So the approach was, we want to put tools in your toolbox. We're not trying to take things away. Now, that's a challenging thing to sell to the community, right? Because you're going to a bunch of people. They don't like their cheese moved. If there's anything we know about people on the internet, they don't like their cheese moved. If they're used to doing something some way, we've done it that way for 10 years or 15 years, we should just keep doing it that way, right? So, Larry, could you talk a little bit about what the response was from many people when you asked them to move?
Most people were reluctant. They didn't want to come over. Some of them I sent messages to that provided support, and eventually most of those did come over. There were still a couple that didn't, but it's strange. These same people that didn't want to come are also our biggest supporters, saying how much they love it now. And we have this success in part due to Ian Weiser. He set up classes. He set up workshops to help us learn things like how to create categories and how the tag system worked and things along that lines. It wouldn't have been possible without his effort. And Aaron, Prisk, and Morrow have been excellent at getting us the things on the technical side that we need. So it's all been a team effort. I can tell you it's much better having the community whole, because being there with developers, the canonical employees, you're just you're dialed in so much more. And we got developers answering support questions, and there's just a whole lot more activity, and everybody's feeling good about it.
So, a huge thank you to both you and Jane. Jane couldn't be here because New Zealand's kind of a far stretch, but maybe next year. A huge thanks to you guys for doing that. When you're taking the approach of so we're not going to just flip the switch. What I'm hearing from you is we're not just going to flip the switch and say, this is off, this is on, now go here. But can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what was the difference in culture as you moved to discourse?
Well, there was a whole lot of different perceptions because of the fact that it was all developers and canonical. They didn't offer support at all. So our moderation techniques as far as the moderation team was different, because we tend to be strict on some things, but we also understand they come there for support. They're already frustrated. We need to make it easy for them to get support in the support category. And figuring out how to do that was challenging. Aaron Prisk helped along that line greatly, and we worked out most of that, but our user base finds it a culture shock that they can't just come in and post right away. They need to read like 15 minutes, and they don't even read that when they come in usually, that they need to read, so that does create issues. But really, it's going really smooth, and it's due to the acceptance and the teachings and the moderation that was already on discourse.
I want to touch, so discourse is the form. The other migration that happened recently is the move to Matrix. And this, I think, it's multifaceted. I think the first part I want to address is how challenging was it to move to Matrix? You've given us kind of an idea what it was like on the forums. Can you compare and contrast that to me for moving the chat?
It wasn't hard at all. I mean, all I had to do was download the software, hit single sign-on with my username, and it just logs me in. It's simple. IRC, not so simple. It's just not. Not if you're setting up rooms and things like that, and if it's a private room, there's a lot of extra things to go through, and it's just not that difficult on Matrix. It's a whole lot better.
So, no emoji support. So yeah.
I think some important context for those who don't know is Ubuntu has as a governing body. Things don't just happen because Canonical dictates. There's a community-run governing body that these are elected folks. There's an IRC council. There's a council that was built around the management and the policies around using the IRC protocol. So a lot of these changes, you say, it's easy, flip a switch, but it's not that simple, right? This has to be a consensus. So there's a technical element, obviously, creating a platform that millions of people can use daily to get their work done, to collaborate, and then the more, I say, like political piece that is just as important. So we've discussed about creating like a communications council, a more unified, I use this example. We don't have like an HTML council, so maybe we shouldn't bind certain protocols to councils, make them more generalized for the purpose as opposed to the protocol. I want to kind of get Nathan's opinion here as a community council member and how he has seen these things transpire in his time as a leader.
So the neat thing is that the free software community and especially volunteer communities tend to form out of practicality and convenience. As well, not just this is really fun and hard to do, and we did it, but also that's easy and fun. But then, we need something we can support, and that's hard. So, we've seen as, I think IRC is super easy, barely an inconvenience, and I think Matrix is sort of weird because it's federated. Although I would have to say that. It's actually not that hard to use. It's one more client to have open on my desktop. But when people started using Matrix, some of the younger people, Jason, really wanted to push for this, and so he got a bunch of people on Matrix. At the same time, we had been pushing between Discourse and other things to get a canonical. Employees who are on different teams and community members on different teams to talk more about what they do on Discourse and other places in one single place. And Canonical used, was it Mattermost? Yeah, so privately to communicate. And the number one question I got at Ubuntu Summit are things like, why can't I find you on Mattermost, Nathan? And I said, I don't work for Canonical. I'm like, oh, but you used to. I'm like, no, I never have. So Matrix was a place. I just do a lot of things for free because I'm not paying for Windows. I said I'll just do a little tiny expo, run a booth, and now here I am. So Matrix was a way to get Canonical in a place and talking where they could also talk with the community, still be private and secure, but also interact. I talked at the Ubuntu Summit in Riga a lot about how we are one big community. Everyone here, the people watching live stream, all the employees, and the forums were getting harder and harder to. IRC is getting harder and harder to administrate. There's less people there. It's a very large barrier to entry. The forums, are older technology. Forums used to be everywhere. They're waning. It's harder to support. Discourse is more modern. And so out of practicality, people said, instead of splitting up these different audiences, real-time communication, online, asynchronous stuff, how can we combine them, and how do we get together? And since I'm not really a big web messaging person myself, I stayed way out of it, but because I'm on the community council, I was privy to all the conversations and the approaches and who did what and all the plans. And I have to say that in both cases, both the IRC council and the forum council and moderators were like, okay, let's do this. Let's work together. How is this, let's make this smoothly. How do we do this? And all the plans and all the work and everything, I know that with Ian, with Larry and the other moderators, Jane, I've only heard good things, how easy this was, how cooperative everyone was, how excited people were to work together. From all parties involved independently, the vibe I get is how everyone's working together and how happy they are that, you move a forum to Discourse, there'll be some clashes, be tumultuous, it's just hard to change. And it went super, super smoothly, and everyone was all happy. That's the nice thing about Ubuntu and working together, and the code of conduct is that smooth things a bit, smooth things out a bit, but there's not really, it's not a struggle. People work together.
Okay, I want to point something out. I don't even have to say anything. I can just exemplify this by asking a question. Jason, how old are you?
24.
24. Nathan, how old are you?
Almost 45.
Okay, there's the difference between the IRC folks and the Matrix folks, okay? The people that are above a certain age will tell you, IRC is very simple, it's very easy, it's worked for 20 years, it continues to work, what's the problem? The problem is, respectfully, that we have an entire new generation that are addicted to glowing smart things in front of their faces, and it doesn't necessarily translate well to IRC. Not that you can't do it, but they want emojis and texts and reactions and all of the various things. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. Do you mind sharing or recapping a brief portion of the conversation you had with your daughter when you attempted to introduce her to IRC?
For context, my daughter's 16, so I figure any platform that we set up, if she can't use it, it's probably not a good platform for the future. I think I showed her IRC, and I think she asked, what era is this from? So I think we have a real, I guess from our perspective is I've been a beneficiary of this community from a work of some people that have been here and have done enormous work for a number of years, and I want to make sure the next generation can also benefit from that. There's a real concern about the graying of our community. We have a lot of bus factor. We have some amazing people that are like Atlas, that hold an enormous amount of work on their shoulders, and we just assume they're going to be around forever, but they're not going to be. So if we're not properly mentoring that next generation of users, there will not be an UbuCon 2035, and that concerns me. I want to make sure that we leave the community stronger than we all found it. If that's anything I think we can all agree on, that's the most important thing. And that's not me just dogging on IRC. I think we shouldn't have sacred cows of any platform or thing, right? We should be flexible and build a community that people want to be a part of, and that comes with challenges. But that's what makes Ubuntu and open source so fun, is that it's reaching the consensus and working together to find what that next thing is.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how you landed on Matrix specifically? It seems like there's a number of different platforms that we could have gone to, right? Could have gone to Signal, could have gone to Telegram, could have gone to, even the WhatsApp and Facebooks and you name it, there's a never-ending list of communication platforms. By nature of being a communication platform, it has to be online, so there's less of a concern there. But why Matrix of all the different places or all different things that we could have chose to centralize on?
Thankfully, we've let others be the guinea pig for us. Now, looking around what other open source communities, especially ones that we partner, we work with, they went to Matrix. And we thought, okay, we work really well with these folks. They chose it. It works well for their community. We want a place we can talk with them on. So it just kind of made sense to go that route. Like I said, there are others, and we looked at a few others, but that one just kind of made the most sense. So the GNOME community and the KDE community, there's a lot of other communities we work with every single day, and if they're there, we should be too.
Can you talk a little bit about the cohesion between Canonical employees and the community side? So even in this panel, you will see people here that officially receive a paycheck from Canonical, and those that are oftentimes here on their own time and often on their own dime. The idea previously, we kind of touched on this, is that there were different platforms. If you were on the community side, you're over here, and if you are an employee, you're over there. Can you talk a little bit about the cohesion that's occurred post-migration to Matrix?
So first thing I'll say is I think it's pretty easy to identify who the Canonical employees are up here. I'm saying we might be wearing a very intense color right now, but can't miss us, if you're walking around. But I think, the meshing between community and Canonical has been very interesting on Matrix, in the fact that it's a lot less of like a walled garden or kind of screaming into the void and hoping you hear an answer back. I think, you're starting to see a lot more collaboration between, Canonical teams and community members. I think a perfect example is Snap, where we have a lot of contributors who are coming in who are very passionate about seeing the packaging format succeed, and they're actually now starting to make contributions to upstream tooling that we have, like Snapcraft. They're finding issues in the store that they're reporting, working with the desktop team to actually make it work quite nice, and actually provide that feedback and do that advocacy work of going to other open source communities and kind of saying like, hey, here's a really valid way of consuming your software. So it's quite interesting to see. I think another thing that's been really cool to see too is like Canonical teams like wanting to work with people and mentor them as well. So for example, within Canonical, we have a very strong technical author practice. They use a framework called Diataxis. And they actually, just kind of one day said like, oh yeah, we want to start an open documentation academy because, open source is not just code, it's a whole bunch of different stuff as well. And one important thing is really documentation. You figure, look at a lot of like proprietary projects and, obviously they have a vested interest in people knowing how to use it and use it well because then they get more contracts. But sometimes open source, it's like, oh, the code is a documentation, or, just think about it, man, it's so easy. And so actually, it becomes important there to also teach people how to contribute documentation as well, where it's like, hey, you're going through and you find a bug, what's the whole process for actually fixing it? How can you actually make sure you're writing good documentation that people can understand and actually learn something? So I think that's been interesting as well. And then the last thing that's also been really cool to see is like a lot of teams are starting to do like public office hours, so they're starting to be a lot more transparent about roadmaps. There's been a huge interest. I know obviously Jira, I think it's the bane of all software developers in existence, but it is a pretty useful way of actually doing capacity planning and allocating tasks. And there's been a lot of actual interest in kind of being more transparent about what teams are doing, what the roadmaps are, what the requirements are. And so a lot of teams start doing like public office hours where folks can just kind of show up, either just have a conversation or ask questions, and then also they can kind of provide input on kind of the direction certain projects are taking. So yeah.
Yeah.
So, in the also on the theme of, well, first of all, if Jason's going to disagree with me and rebut me on IRC, then in the realm of the code is the documentation. Python is executable pseudocode, so it sort of is halfway there. But on the topic of converging things and working together, Aaron and Prisk here and Mara Gaspari, who could make it, worked really hard to set up every other month an Ubuntu governance meeting, which is just open-ended. And so all the people on there's a forum council and an IRC council, and I shouldn't start naming them. Everyone's going to feel left out. There's a community council. There's the Ubuntu membership board. There's all these different groups, and they can all come together and sort of talk about, hey, what's going on. So we know my job on the community council is to kind of know what's going on, and thanks for making my job easier. I can go just jump in, but we want to work together because there's so many things that. If you know what's going on, you can sort of anticipate things, and if you can help each other out, you might never ask someone who's like, "Oh, I've done that before," even though I'm doing it here, or we face this problem. And so, just like we're trying, Canonical made a effort to get Canonical employees not to think of themselves as walled off, indifferent from the Ubuntu community. They're part of the Ubuntu community. We're getting all the leadership together to work together, because you never know when you start bouncing, discussing things, what ideas might come up.
So I want to touch a little bit more on a proper mentorship program. So there is kind of this, I don't want to say entitled attitude, but this idea that the Kens and the Larrys and the Steves are going to be around forever, and it's just not accurate. So to a degree, there is a need for a proper mentorship program, and it is incumbent upon us, the previous generation, to make it appealing for the next generation. It is not on them to adopt to our way of doing things. And perhaps I'll start with Aaron. Can you talk to me a little bit about what a proper mentorship program looks like, and how we frame that so that there isn't an expectation that they're just going to pick it up?
I will shout out our friend Till at Canonical, who is a superstar. Till has been going to a number of universities recently in India to reach out to potential students to basically to start a proper mentorship program, and has found some of the most hardcore, amazing, passionate developers there. So you need to go to where those people are, as opposed to just yelling into the void, "Hey, come learn how to do this thing." And going and finding out what skills that these universities have, and then also working with these universities and showing, okay, what skills do their students need to be successful in the open source space. So I think it's got to be twofold. Like we have to give them some value. Like we need to share our knowledge with them, and in turn find out what they know and how they can benefit us. Right. I think we should also be humble to know that we don't know everything. So if you lead with that mentality, I think Till is doing it the right way. I'd love to hear anyone else here what they think. Till! Go Till!
Sorry. So one thing I think for when it comes to mentorship programs, and obviously it might be a little weird, me, the 24-year-old, saying, "Oh yeah, mentor, one of the graybeards," but I find that one thing that really helps too is just kind of being cognizant of the fact that there is kind of a wider community of folks out there who do want to actually get involved in open source software, whether maybe it's for self-servicing purposes of like job training, or whether they're actually just kind of feeling a little altruistic. But the idea is that all of us up here were once folks who started out and didn't know what the ls command did. They just were trying to figure out what the files printed and all that, and so you just kind of find that we all kind of started as beginners who didn't know what we were doing. And so I think one thing that helps is always being like, man, I really wish that, this thing existed when I was getting started. For me, as like a software developer, I like it when like open source projects have, neatly contained, good first issues where it's like, kind of low impact changes, or maybe changes that a novice can kind of pick up and actually get a good introduction to the project. I think also like maintaining, robust contributing guidelines as well that actually are up to date and kind of reflective of what the developer expectations are. And then I also think at the other time, having strong code of conduct is also important, actually enforcing it, because, at the end of the day, if people just get bullied off and they're like told like, you suck, go away, they won't come back. And so I think it's important to kind of always know that, have a COC that kind of outlines being respectful, always assuming best intentions, and, while still appreciating merit, also kind of knowing that everybody kind of started from square one or square zero, and that, they need to be given a fair chance too.
Something to say as well. We're trying to target the next generation of developers, you've really got to have the correct platform. And we were talking about the desktop being a huge thing for Canonical earlier, and it's amazing how somebody wrote an article in the Ubuntu blog a while back about Ubuntu for education being a thing, and it's one of those things where I'm going to go ahead and plug this for my wife. She's the lead for Ubuntu, and she's a preschool teacher, or actually a preschool director now, and she wanted to bring this back so that the next generation would have the ability to experience open source software, experience what's actually out there. There's a couple of games in there, and there's also the ability to get the ability to learn how to program and how to write code on there. We got Basic 256 that I think of right off the top of my head. I learned how to program in Basic at the age of 10. And I know that there are children out there who are just as capable. And we also target that towards university as well, because there's plenty of tools for note-taking, for science, for just general reference. And then, like Ken was alluding to earlier, with data scientists, you can always run those systems just as easily as you could as on Ubuntu desktop as you can on Ubuntu, because it's the exact same thing, just tailored to education.
You guys all seem very positive, so I'm going to pee on the parade a little bit. Can you guys tell me where you see some opportunity for growth by way of getting younger people involved in open source, in Ubuntu, in the next generations? Where are some areas for us to grow as a community where we're a little weak right now, and maybe an opportunity to make things a little better? Maybe I'll lean on you, Aaron, for that.
So my background is in education. I spent 12 years as an IT director in public schools, so it's very much close to my heart. And Chromebooks basically took over at least American education, and these are very closed ecosystems. I think gone are the days where I remember being in school where you could tinker. That incentive to tinker is kind of gone, which is concerning to me. So I think we need to, this is where like those STEM programs, like you put a computer in front of a kid, eventually they're gonna mess with it, right? It's just the way they're wired. I would like to see that take place of more like STEM programs, more like trade schools, where kids have the opportunity to experiment and to learn, like you mentioned basic, learn Python, learn programming languages. I think that has to happen at a very young age, because I think that will follow with them for years to come. I think it's a great opportunity. And also I mentioned this like in regards to like the forums, the discourses, we need to provide the platforms to facilitate this type of collaboration. We need to make it easy for someone who has like a passing interest or skill to find out how they can contribute their unique skills to our community. Because sometimes I hear this sentiment a lot when I go to these conferences. They go, I really want to help, but I don't know how. Or they go, I don't really know C++, how could I possibly help? So what do you do? Well, I like to do pixel art. Cool, come make a nice wallpaper for us, that would be great. So we need to do a better job on our side of showing people that you don't need to be a C programmer to be a respected member of the community. And yeah, I'll pass it over to these guys.
One thing that I also think would help when it kind of comes to, I guess you could say, peeing on the parade and what we should actually be doing better. I think it's like also just, where practice meets theory. I think it's kind of easy for us to sit up here in this chair and be like, oh yeah, all things are great. But I think at the end of the day, obviously you get the conference high of being like, oh yeah, it's great to talk to everybody and we had all these new ideas. But then, you think like a week or two afterwards, everybody just kind of forgets what they talked about or don't actually follow up, or you send off an email and maybe it ended up in the spam bin. I don't know, but there's some folks I'm still waiting to hear back from. I think it's, important to realize that, you really need to, like, if you're going to talk about like, hey, we want to bring new people in, you need to actually do it, and you need to actually spend time doing it. It can't just be kind of a 15% best effort kind of deal. It's like, it's like, oh, I want to like create good issues. You need to create good issues. You can't just, grab problems that you think are beneath you and slap a good first issue on it, but then you very clearly have a way you want it to be solved and all that. And I think when it comes to like, oh, documentation, like I want to have good documentation. You need to actually write it. You need to put a lot of effort into actually doing it. And I think that's always something that's, just kind of comes over time, continual growth. But I think, being able to actually put in the work, I think is what's really important. And so, yeah.
Can I speak to that too? Thank you. I was going to bring up documentation. It does still need a lot of work, but we need to centralize it all in one place where users can find it, especially new users. And it needs to be a place where the platform is maintained and well kept, and if you got to edit, that you can actually edit easily, because right now we don't have that so much.
I want to dovetail off of that if I can to a degree. Can you guys, somebody touch on the concept of documentation from the perspective of a new user? So I'm going to put a statement out there. You guys either correct me or confirm what I'm saying. If you have somebody that doesn't have a lot of technical expertise, who is maybe slightly new on the scene, in some ways, that person is the most ideal person to write documentation, because they're going to understand where the holes in the road are, where some of us with maybe a little bit more experience, we're taking such large steps. We step right over the hole and don't even notice it's there.
So I wrote a book called Beginning Ubuntu for Windows and Mac Users. That's in 3rd edition, and maybe they'll think about a 4th edition, which would be nice. But so I wrote it. When I was young, and I have a great guide to standard Unix, a structured introduction in German from like 1987, and it starts. This is input and output: keyboard, monitor, printer, tape drive, because it's that old. And that's how I learned computers. We had a big chart with a Mac, Apple II or something like that in 3rd grade on the wall, and it was this and that. And we don't really get that anymore. Everyone uses smartphones. But when I wrote the book, I said, well, okay, so let's start with someone who's used to Windows, and they don't need to know what a mouse is and a right click is and how to use a word processor. Ubuntu is cool. I'll put it on my old computer. Now what? Well, how do I use it? It's so different. So I actually wrote it in the style of almost like a little introduction, but and then a bunch of like topics. But I wrote it like a travel guide. If you go to one of those, go to AAA and get a travel guide about take a trip to Europe or Germany or something like that, and it tells you these are what the streets are called. This is the side of the road you drive on. This is how if you walk into a bar in Germany. I wrote this. They said we like it and said please take it out. It's not relevant in the introduction. If you go to Germany and you go to a pub and all the tables are taken, right? There's seats. You walk up to a seat and you say, "Ist hier noch frei?" In German, is this seat taken? Up to a stranger, and they'll say no, and you just sit down and either usually chit chat with them a little. They don't do a lot of chit chatting in Germany, or you just do your own thing. But you just walk up to a table and sit down. Or if you go to a cafe, you just sit down at an outdoor table, and they'll come find you. You don't go find. I went to an ice cream parlor. I wasn't sure if the outside was open. They were like, just sit down. Well, they said in German. And even though I knew that, right? So I think it's really important to have language and even a structure that is approachable to someone so they can ease themselves in sometimes.
If I can add just one interesting observation is the Ubuntu Wiki, which has also been around since like the start of the project, I did like an analysis not too long ago. I think it's 96,000 pages on it. Of those, a lot of them probably aren't of a lot of value, but there is still an enormous amount of value on that. When I did to look at the most like top visited pages, a lot of it is technical documentation, how-tos, guides. I think one was like using KVM in Ubuntu. And I took this list to our documentation team. I said, why are people still going to these pages? Like, there's something to be learned from this. And that is, for some reason, they find that what is on the wiki was either more valuable or it was easier for them to follow than our official documentation, which is concerning. Or, in some cases, the wiki was just being pushed above good official documentation. So that's concerning either way. So we were discussing, like, we have this very, again, formalized documentation structure that Canonical follows, but sometimes Jason might just want to share a quick little, hey, here's how I made my desktop look cool. That's not really formal documentation. It's not really an official how-to. Where do those things live? So it lends some credibility to like why these type of wikis are still relevant in 2024. Just something I thought was fairly interesting. It shows like there's still a value in that user-generated content.
100%. To your point, what is the most frustrating to the orange people, I'm sure, but what is the most popular place when you don't know how to solve a problem on Linux or you Google it? What comes up 9 out of 10 times? ArchWiki, right? It is, I know, the orange people are upset, I'm sorry. But recognizing that problem and recognizing that reality is the first step to saying, hey, we are going to embrace user-generated content. We're gonna, you notice that Aaron didn't say, so he wants to save his content. We're just going to not put it on the internet. It's where do those people live? Where does that content live? Hey, the music in my ears means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. If you like this content, we record this show every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. It's streamed online at AskNoahShow.com and available on the radio in the Grand Forks area at 88.3. We're back next Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com.